Have you ever looked at a modern world map or maybe the UN headquarters and just assumed they've always been there? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive right into the crucible of the 20th century. We're unpacking how the sheer tension, immense conflict, and intense diplomacy of the Second World War literally forged the modern world we live in today. Because honestly, almost all of our current global institutions, our borders, and even our economic alliances were born directly from the fires of this massive 6-year conflict. Let's get into it. To really trace this massive global shift, we'll follow a clear path, starting with the road to conflict, moving through the course of the war, taking a look behind the scenes at wartime diplomacy, checking out the post-war settlements, and finally unpacking its global legacy.
All right, starting off with Part 1, the road to conflict.
The 1930s really triggered this devastating domino effect. It started when the League of Nations basically did nothing after Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. This inaction sent a loud and clear message to aggressive nations. The international community is completely powerless. By 1933, both Germany and Japan just walked right out of the League, and that emboldened Hitler to remilitarize the Rhineland in 1936. By the time the Munich Conference rolled around in 1938, this policy of appeasement essentially gave Germany a giant green light to take the Sudetenland. It was just this endless pattern of concession, and it only encouraged the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo axis to keep expanding until war became absolutely inevitable when Poland was invaded in 1939.
Which brings us to a really fascinating underlying question. Was Nazi Germany actually more aggressive in the 1930s than the German Empire was right before the First World War?
The contrast here is actually staggering. Sure, before the First World War, Germany was definitely militaristic. They were heavily involved in army and naval arms races and busy building strategic alliances. But they didn't really have direct territorial expansion within Europe. Fast forward to the 1930s, and it's a completely different story. Nazi Germany wasn't just competing, they were actively defying international treaties by aggressively rearming. Hitler went for blunt, forced annexations of his neighbors, like Austria with the Anschluss, and eventually, of course, the invasion of Poland. The aggression completely shifted from competitive posturing to literal, forceful conquest.
That brings us to Part 2, the course of the war.
Okay, the absolute crucial turning point to remember here is the year 1941. In Stage 1 of the conflict, the Axis powers were totally dominating using their blitzkrieg, or lightning war tactics, which led to the shockingly fast fall of places like France and the Netherlands. But 1941 changed everything. In June, Nazi Germany broke its non-aggression pact and invaded the USSR. Then, in December, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. By doing this, they dragged the immense industrial and military might of both the Soviets and the United States directly into the fight on the side of the Allies. Ultimately, the Axis powers sealed their own fate right there, paving the exact road to the Allied victories in Stage 3.
Moving right along to Part 3, wartime diplomacy.
Behind closed doors, while the battles were raging, the diplomatic strategy underwent a wildly fascinating evolution. Back in 1941, with the Atlantic Charter, Roosevelt and Churchill were laying out some highly idealistic peace aims. Things like no territorial gains and the right of people to choose their own governments. But as the brutal reality of the war set in, you can see the tone dramatically shift. By the 1943 Casablanca and Moscow conferences, the #1 demand became the total, unconditional surrender of the Axis powers, no compromises. Finally, by 1945 at Yalta and San Francisco, all that early idealism transformed into concrete geopolitical engineering. They were drawing up hard borders, splitting Germany into occupation zones, and officially founding the United Nations.
Now let's look at Part 4, the post-war settlements.
The settlement with Germany wasn't just a simple peace treaty. It was a completely methodical, structured dismantling of the Nazi state. The goal wasn't just to end the war, but to guarantee it could never, ever happen again. So they divided both the country itself and the capital city of Berlin into 4 distinct occupation zones. They systematically prosecuted the former leadership, outright outlawed the Nazi Party, and enforced incredibly strict demilitarization and democratization. On top of that, the map was physically redrawn. All conquered territories were returned, and specific regions, like East Prussia, were handed over to Poland and the USSR.
Over in the Pacific, we see a parallel but slightly different approach for Japan. Instead of being carved up into multiple zones controlled by different countries, Japan was centrally occupied under the supreme commander of the Allied powers, General MacArthur, and it was overseen by the Far Eastern Commission. But just like Germany, Japan was entirely disarmed, and massive efforts were put in place to develop a democratic government. Crucially,
And this honored the Cairo Declaration. Japan was forced to return all the territories it had conquered, which included restoring Taiwan to China.
And finally, Part 5, the global legacy.
So what does this all mean for us? Well, the global balance of power completely inverted. While the First World War merely shook the foundations of the European establishment, the sheer unimaginable devastation of the Second World War effectively ended European global supremacy for good. Heavyweights like Britain, France, and Germany lost their dominant status. Plus, think about the map. After WWI, European empires mostly managed to hold on to their colonies. But WW2 sparked an absolute wildfire of decolonization across Africa and Asia, as former colonies rightly demanded their independence. Even our global peacekeeping got a massive upgrade, moving from the fairly weak Europe-centric League of Nations to the truly global United Nations we know today.
And this massive geopolitical earthquake was totally mirrored in everyday society. After the First World War, the status of women saw some improvements, like gaining voting rights. But WWI elevated this so much further, as women stepped into active combat and heavy industry roles, literally becoming pilots and machine gunners. It's also super interesting to look at belief systems. The trauma of WWI actually reduced global faith in democracy, but the horrific, undeniable realities of totalitarianism exposed during WWI, that actually reaffirmed the world's faith in democracy and freedom. Economically speaking, instead of failing to cooperate like everyone did in the 1920s, the post-WWI powers realized that collective action for economic recovery wasn't just a good idea, it was absolutely critical for survival.
Ultimately, the end of the conflict left a massive, glaring power vacuum right in the heart of Europe, and that vacuum was perfectly filled by two nations. First, the United States, whose mainland was completely untouched by the war and whose economy was absolutely booming. And second, the Soviet Union, which had expanded its military presence massively into Eastern Europe. Almost overnight, these two nations emerged as the world's undeniable superpowers, each leading their own bloc of allied countries directly into the standoff of the Cold War.
So, the Second World War didn't just quietly end. It violently birthed the modern era of rival superpowers, global organizations, and independent nations that we navigate every single day. As we wrap up this explainer and look around at the rising global tensions in our world right now, I want to leave you with this final thought. If the institutions built in 1945 were specifically designed to prevent another global catastrophe, are they still strong enough to hold our world together today? Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next explainer.